investments can accelerate gender equality in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have a great set of experts out there who will provide their insights to you. My name is Alice Brandt. You cannot see me. I will turn on my camera now. I am your moderator today. And before we begin, I need to tell you that this session is being recorded. So if you don't wish to be recorded, I must kindly ask you to leave the session now. We will upload the presentation, so the slides and the recording, onto YouTube and our website later on. So we will all be famous. If you're not speaking, kindly turn off your camera and mute yourself. That will be very helpful. And yeah, let's begin. I will introduce you to the stars of our show today. And again, please do turn off your camera whenever you're not speaking. Thank you. Now, let's see if this works. Yes, it does. So we will begin by an input from Regina Rossman, a former GIZ colleague. And she is now an associate at Convergence Finance, which is the global network for blended finance. There she works in the trainings and engagement team, and she is in the teams, and she's also Convergence's gender focal point. Welcome, Regina. And next up will be Luis Marquez, who is an advisor for gender and the private sector at Value for Women, which is a specialized advisory firm helping organizations advance in gender inclusion. He will be followed by an input by Joy Anderson, who is the founder and president of Criterion Institute. Something is happening on my screen here. Okay. Yeah, Criterion Institute serves as a think tank around shaping markets to create social and environmental good. And last but not least, we are honored to have today on board as well Genevieve Edens, who is the director and ESG at Water Equity. There, she is responsible for establishing policies and processes for ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and impact management, and supports the investment management team in deploying capital and monitoring the portfolio. Welcome. She will join the other three experts in the panel. Now, let me just very briefly walk you through the agenda. So we have been doing the introduction of speakers. And now we will move on to Regina Rossman, who will provide sort of an introductory overview to the topics that we will discuss today. And then Luis Marquez will outline the landscaping of gender lens investing in Latin America and the Caribbean. And Joy Anderson will focus on the wash sector with some nice examples. Then we will have a 10-minute break, during which we kindly ask you to fill out a little survey if you loved the webinar, and if you loved it, how much you loved it. It will be just 3 questions, and it will be very helpful for us. Thank you. And then we will have a 15-minute great panel discussion where you as audience will also get to ask some questions and interact with the experts. So, without further ado, I will kindly ask Regina on stage now. There you go. Thank you very much. And I will click the slides for you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alice. And it's great to see some familiar faces here in the seminar. So good to see all of you. I'm going to start by just putting a box around this word of gender lens investing, which is a bit of a daunting task, but I will attempt to do it. So if we go to the next slide, for the purposes of today's seminar, I would like us all to think about gender lens investing as deliberately incorporating a gender analysis into a financial analysis in order to get to better outcomes. Now, this term gender lens investing is relatively new. It was coined in 2009. And so over the last 10 years, there has been a lot of movement. And if you ask different people, they may define it a bit differently. But for today, let's just think about gender lens investing as an effort to make gender matter in decision-making in financial markets. And what that implies is that currently, for the most part, in financial markets, gender does not matter enough, right? Because otherwise, there would be nothing for us to change. And so, what's the problem, or what issue is gender lens investing trying to address? Gender lens investing is trying to address power imbalances. It's trying to address biases, whether they are conscious or unconscious biases. And it's trying to address privileges that are based on maybe race or gender and other factors. And so if we are trying to incorporate a gender analysis into the system of finance, then we are trying to look more closely at how value is being assigned, how relationships are structured, and how processes work. And to give you an example, currently, in some places, it's easier for male CEOs to raise money for their company or for their organization than it is for female CEOs. And one reason may be that investors, so whether that's commercial banks or private equity firms, see female-owned companies or institutions as riskier investments than male-owned institutions. And so that could be due to a bias, right? It could be that they just simply don't believe that the woman can lead this company as successfully as a man. Or it could be because they don't believe that this business model that this business has come up with can be successful. And so trying to integrate a gender analysis is trying to look at these factors and trying to make sure that we are free of biases and that we assess based on data that includes gender as a factor in the decision making. If you look to the right here, you'll see a beautiful diagram that I found in one of the very many helpful resources that Criterion Institute has put out there. And you will hear from Joy herself later on, so stay tuned for that. The reason why I chose this one, because it's very helpful if you have not engaged with gender that much before. It shows you the 3 ways how you can support women and girls through investing. So access to capital is one obvious way, because women are a lot of times still excluded from financial markets. Workplace equity is another important area, right? So trying to reduce gender pay gaps, for example. And then lastly, products and services that cater to women and girls. But gender lens investing can have many other goals as well, such as improving corporate governance, because research has shown that if you have more diverse opinions present at your board level, you can come to better decisions, right? So including more women, if they are underrepresented before, can lead to better decisions from a governance perspective as well. And then lastly, gender lens investing also has the goal of transforming the health and education provided to women and girls, because there's many gaps there. And very importantly, in the end, gender lens investing can be a strategy for financial outperformance, because a lot of these factors that I just described are just simply holding back women from participating in the economy. And if you address them, you can actually also create more financial returns for everybody. Next slide, please. So here I've put together just a few of the resources that have recently been published on gender lens investing. There's many more out there. The point I'm trying to make here is that no matter whether it's an impact investing firm, a development bank like the CDC, so the UK's Development Finance Institution, or a think tank or a research institution, they are all thinking about gender equality and they are all contributing to this debate. So feel free to explore some of these resources after the seminar. Next slide, please. So if you ask yourself who is involved in this movement of gender lens investing, I've put together a few examples here. Let me start with the very left logo here, Women's World Banking. This is a nonprofit institution. And at the same time, Women's World Banking also has created an asset management company called Women's World Banking Asset Management. And this company has successfully raised 2 private equity funds that invest in financial inclusion for women. The last one, Women's World Banking Capital Partners 2, raised $100 million from a variety of different investors to provide capital to microfinance institutions and commercial banks in developing countries that try to increase financial inclusion. So that's just one example. A very different example that may be familiar to some of you is Pro Mujer, which is an NGO that operates in Latin America and provides health and education services to women and also combats gender-based violence. So a very different actor, but also involved in the same space. And then there is a couple of impact investors, development agencies, and so on. So the point here really is that gender matters to everyone, no matter whether you are sitting in a development agency, in a commercial bank, or in a company, or in a research institution. This topic is of importance, and not just today, overall. Next slide, please. So to set up today's discussion, I just wanted to give you two examples of what we are talking about more concretely here. So the first example that I brought you here is a company that attracts capital from gender lens investors. So what is a gender lens investor looking for in a company? So let's think of a social enterprise that provides water and or sanitation services to low-income populations, such as Jibu, for example, which is a social enterprise operating in Africa. For this company, integrating gender considerations means things like providing training to staff on gender issues, whether that's on gender-based violence or on gender pay gap or other topics, and translating these findings into company policies in the end. It also means collecting and reporting gender disaggregated data to the board, but also to potential funders and investors. So for example, the leadership of this company should be able to tell you how many women Jibu employs and what percentage of customers are female, for example. And it also means to test the products and services that this company offers on women and not just on men. And lastly, this company should always keep in mind the female representation in leadership positions and at board level. So that's just some examples of how a gender lens translates on the company level. So now on the next slide, let's look at the fund level, so one level higher up. A gender lens fund, think of a private equity fund, for example, that invests in small businesses. If it truly adopted a gender lens, then the theory of change should sound somewhat like investing in businesses who pay attention to gender means investing in businesses with better decision-making processes, who attract more talent, who develop better products that are suitable not just to men, but also to women, and in the end, who probably perform better if you compare them to companies that do not integrate a gender lens. And so if this fund wants to integrate a gender lens into its considerations, the fund will do things like, for example, asking potential borrowers questions about gender equality during the due diligence process. For example, the fund may well ask, what is the percentage of female representatives in the leadership positions in that company? And secondly, that data that's being obtained is just not sitting there waiting around. That data is transformed into action, so it can inform an investment strategy, for example. And lastly, it's not just about asking once about gender equality during due diligence, it's about asking continuously, so continuous reporting. I hope with these examples and these names that I dropped on the way, I've made the topic a little more clear, and I look forward to more discussion with all of you later. Back to you, Alice.
Thank you so much, Regina. One second. Yes, thank you so much for exemplifying what integrating a gender lens at different levels exactly means, what it can look like, and it for outlining the different problems, the many goals, and really diverse actors that are concerned or can be concerned with applying a gender lens, which is technically everybody. Thank you so much. We will move on to Luis Marquez. Are you out there? The floor is yours, and we will be hearing from you with a regional focus on the Latin America and wider Caribbean region. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So just to start, I'm Luis Marquez, work for Value for Women. We're a global consultancy based out of the UK, but with presence in Latin America and emerging markets. And we help people such as yourselves, development finance institutions, investors, policymakers, and particularly SMEs to apply a gender lens, which is what we're talking about. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So today the goal is to give you a little bit of a landscape of what gender lens investing, particularly impact investing with a gender lens, looks like in Latin America, based on some work that we've done, and then give you a few highlights of what we think this means for people like you. So next slide, please. So I think just based off what Regina just said, so gender lens investing translated, this definition of gender lens investing translated for us, and I think for many people in the field, is about getting more money and helping the organizations led by women, by women to grow and thrive. But also, a value for women, we like to think of gender forward businesses as those that intentionally seek to rectify gender inequalities in these three areas that also Regina talked about: the value chain, products and services, and gender diversity within the firm, as businesses that we want to grow and thrive, and that we want to receive more financing, particularly those that are coming up with innovative social solutions in different key sectors, such as basic services like water, and but also financial inclusion, agriculture, and the environment. So next slide.
Thank you very much, Luis. Just one brief interruption, sorry. Everything is going great in this channel, but we're also having a Spanish channel. And it seems that we need to pause 1 second because your slides are not in the Spanish channel yet. I must ask my great technical supporter, Tizian, if maybe you can check what the slide situation is in the Spanish channel.
Yes, Alicia, thank you. I'm on it.
Okay, great. Thanks. And sorry again, Luis, for this interruption, but it's a very nice slide anyway to pause on. Thanks.
Okay, just let me know when I should continue.
Alicia, almost. I have it up. Just give me 30 seconds.
Okay, I'm counting 30, 29, 28. And thank you also to all the participants for bearing with us. You would think a bilingual webinar shouldn't be that hard, but there's always some technical issues. But we're doing our best, and also I will use this moment to tell you that we have a great simultaneous translator, Rosie, who sits in Costa Rica and is doing a great job in translating all of our webinars from English into Spanish and vice versa.
It's ready, Alicia.
Okay, thank you, Joaquin. Luis, back to you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, let's move on to the next slide, please. So yeah, and next slide. So what is the landscape like in Latin America? And I just shared on the link the report that this is based on, which is a couple of years old, but I think still relevant. So well, we know in Latin America we want more solutions that are driven by women, and we know about a third of small and medium enterprises in LAC, formal enterprises, are led by women. But we also know that we have a $93 billion credit gap between what women want and women-led businesses are receiving. We know that venture capital, as far as venture capital and private equity goes, only 6% is going to women-led businesses. And the average that women-led businesses receive is 500,000 versus 12 million for men. And that's data from the IFC. So finance is an issue. Next slide, please. And if we look at the leadership of infrastructure companies in particular, where water utilities and other organizations that are linked to the CREW project are based, this is global data, but with data from Brazil, Mexico, and I think Argentina. And we see the top infrastructure companies around the world, and we see that we have very representation overall, and particularly at the CEO levels and senior roles, mid-level roles. And we know that this is also reflected in technical roles, right? So we have very few women in science, technology, engineering, and math roles. And then obviously in these industries, particularly technicians out in the field and in the headquarters and in the utilities offices. And you'll see that board members, there's more women board members, but that's normally linked to certain policies in countries that have mandates to get more women on board. So that's why you see more women there. Next slide. And so on one side, we need more solutions driven by women, right? And we don't have enough, we're not financing them, and women are not present in the leadership. But then the solutions for women and gender equality, which is what we did a study to look at in Latin America, are not receiving enough financing. So we basically looked at impact investing, right? So that's investing that has a social or environmental focus. And we looked at the businesses that are receiving that financing, and we found that only 11% of these enterprises are striving for social impact with a gender lens. So Regina gave some great examples of what those types of businesses could be that are more related to the water sector. Here I have Solvers, because I like them a lot. They received financing from the Inter-American Development Bank, and they basically formalize domestic workers. They link them to employers, kind of like an Uber situation, but they provide a lot, unlike Uber, there's a lot of formalization that goes and support that goes towards the women that are domestic workers. So we have very few of those businesses and in the ecosystem that's providing these new solutions in Latin America and the Caribbean. Next slide. And then and then we have very few women that are leading those enterprises that are receiving, those social enterprises that are receiving financing, right? So not only are we not focused, are the solutions not focused necessarily on gender, but then we have very few women in there too, right? And so however we measure it, we had very few women. Next slide. And this is despite the fact that we have opportunities. So for example, the global femtech market. So femtech might be a term that's new for some of you. It was new for me about a year and a half ago. It just basically means technology for women's health and women's issues. And so that's likely to grow globally to 50 billion. And then also I looked up feminine hygiene products in Latin America in 2018 was a $2 billion market. Some people think that shouldn't even, that should be paid by the government, et cetera. But anyway, these are big numbers, big markets, and they're normally not redressed by the solutions that we have out there. Next slide. And I'll answer some of those. I'm not going to answer the questions, but they're interesting for later. And then this is worded a little weird, but it's incorrect. So basically, the Inter-American Development Bank did an analysis about who lost their jobs during COVID. And when we talk about lower income populations, we looked at 46% of women lost their jobs versus 31% of men in the last year. And then when we look at water, we know from different household surveys across the region that women are the ones that tend to fetch water compared to men. In El Salvador, for example, 57% of the people that fetch water in these communities that a lot of you are working in, right, where without piped water, they're the ones that tend to fetch the water more than men. Next slide. So why should you care? So some of you might care just because it's important and you think it's the right thing to do. But next slide, thank you. We know from different data that I'm sure you've all seen from Latin America and the Caribbean, we have multiple studies from the IDB, McKinsey, this one on energy utility firms, which we thought was the closest we have to water firms, which was very Ernst & Young, and looked at the most diverse gender energy utility firms globally, including emerging markets. And they looked at the 20 least diverse, and they found that the most diverse ones had a higher return on equity. Our partners cover Impact Capital, which is an impact investor active in emerging markets and in Latin America also. Did a similar analysis, and they found that return on equity for the more diverse firms was about twice the rest. And you can see we have this data for different for a lot of different sectors. Next, please. And then if you're skeptical, and this is similar to what Regina was doing, is we have a lot of investors that are active in the region that are providing financing. Particularly, this was with a focus on the private sector, right? With private sector financing, loans, equity, capital for gender lens funds and investments, right? And so not only for the public sector. So we have a lot of actors that have programs and they're really taking this seriously. So we think there's if that that should be a driver, and more we're seeing that present in the region, and investors are citing that as a reason why they're thinking about gender. Next slide. And it's the right thing to do. Men and women are not on a level playing field. We don't have time to go through all the inequalities in the region, but we know they're still very present throughout. Next slide. So we went and we asked investors what they think, right? So when we're talking about gender lens investing, we talked particularly to impact investors, and they told us that some of them have heard of gender lens investing as a significant portion, but they still think of it as just women, not all these other issues that we've been talking about, right? They are considering investing in gender lens. They don't know where to start. They're afraid of the word gender, of saying that they're gender lens investors. But obviously and Regina went through some key leaders like ProMujer and others that have been doing this for a long time. So there's a few of them, but it's still not mainstream. They lack the sex disaggregated data on the impact of their investment. Even when they're measuring very few indicators, they're not disaggregating by sex, generally speaking. Next slide. And they note that they feel like there's a lack of investment-ready women-led businesses. But then we talk to women, and women are telling us that they don't feel like the financing is there for them, or they're being ignored, or not the right type of financing is there. There's definitely a mismatch in the market there. And finally, there's a common misconception among impact investors that came up quite a bit with about a third of investors we talked to, that targeting women is not meritocratic, or it's a limitation, or we're somehow discriminating against men. So that's something that we're trying to redress and fight. Next. So what can you do about it? And we'll end with the next slide, which is the guide I shared has some of this, and we're working with multiple partners like Alphamundi, Walmart Foundation, et cetera, in the region to apply a version of this approach. Obviously, this is very general, but we think what works is commit, put skin in the game, put money on the table, commit publicly, have the organizations that you work with commit publicly, and so that there's accountability there. And if identify internal gender champions, normally there's a lot of people in middle management in particular that might really want to work on these issues and might see it as good for their careers as well. And so they're ready to be tapped into. Assess opportunities in all the areas, not just in the workforce or not just at the beneficiary level. Try to take that holistic approach. Use sex disaggregated data as an entry point. And focus on solving business problems with a gender lens. So we think that the problem is sometimes or actually the majority of the times, gender is seen as a tangential issue, and you develop some strategy or some project that's, off to the side or different, or like a women's artisans project and a water project, right? So we found that we work with a lot of businesses so that they're solving their business problems with a gender lens, and they're really thinking about how gender fits into their main strategy. Right, and so then that means that they have to define their business or their organizational impact goals, and then fit gender into that, rather than have it a separate thing. And then you make the case for gender with that data, right? So we think that's the most sustainable way of incorporating this into the organization. I'll stop there. I think I'm at time. I'm probably above, but happy to answer some of these questions in the chat and later on.
Great. Thank you so much, Luis, for, oh, yeah, there's some slides still, but never mind. Thank you. You've already said a lot of great input, and you already catalyzed some questions in the chat that we will take up later for the panel discussion. Yeah, we have learned very important statements such as that policies in countries do matter, especially, or like for instance, if it is about determining the percentage of women CEOs in businesses. We have learned the regional investors' perspectives on gender, and as well what businesses can do. What in the wash sector is also quite important, considering the business side of, wash sector. Along the sanitation chain. So thank you, Luis, and we will move on to our third expert today, which is Joy Anderson. And there we go with a great blue background. Thank you so much, Joy. Hold on, this is you. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, I will say I don't have slides. So if you want to click on my face instead of the slides, you can look more directly. Because I thought I would just tell a story. So I've been working in the field of gender lens investing, well, since 2009. Criterion was actually the organization that coined the term in the beginning, and so it's been a wonderful journey. And I think the points that Regina and Luis made are spot on in terms of how to look at gender in investing. So I'm going to bring it into WASH. A few years ago, we were working in the Pacific Islands, and so my apologies. This story is not grounded in Latin America, but I think there are a lot of parallels to draw from it. So as many of you know, the Pacific Islands are a remarkably isolated in many ways, but really rich environment of innovation and other pieces. So we were working with the Australian government in to look at where impact investing and the sort of broader using finance to create social good could be helpful in advancing development goals in the Pacific. And we had been supporting a wide number of financial intermediaries, people who helped capital move to work in the Pacific in different ways. And it was an area, and I think this is true in many rural regions, or sort of isolated regions, where there hadn't been a significant amount of sort of impact investing that you might find in a city. And so we were looking to find solutions. So one of the things that we did was started looking at menstrual health, which is obviously an issue very directly connected to the WASH sector, because it both affects looking at a sort of a move towards reusable sanitary pads and not just disposable, and that's a key issue in so many regions, and particularly in island nations that are directly affected by pollution. And the second piece was so looking at the sort of reusable and versus disposable, but also looking at the people who manufactured the pads. And in the case of the Pacific, these were many local small businesses. And by small, I mean small, right? 2 or 3 people working in a health clinic, or a set of women who had come together in an island to manufacture pads for that island. And so many of these were small groups that had come together to sew pads and increase the access to menstrual health products in those areas, which is, as many of you know, a significant gender equality issue, as access to menstrual health and the stigma attached to it is a critical part of expanding gender equality and ensuring that women can fully participate in education and the workforce. And so here there's this issue. And many NGOs, one of the things that I think is interesting about gender lens investing is that it often overlaps with gender lens investing often overlaps and intersects with works that governments are doing or works that NGOs are doing. It sort of sits at this bridge, right, of people who have traditionally worked on issues of inequality, and how do we bridge that to a conversation about, can finance be helpful? Is bringing the finance sector into a conversation about gender equality worth it? I'm having a small technical moment where I just realized I could spotlight myself, which might actually be helpful. I don't know why I clicked on this randomly, but I don't know if that helps folks. You can always change it back and I'll let the technical assistance people fix it. But if it's easier for you to actually just focus on this story. So we were working on menstrual health in the Pacific, and we brought together 20 women and men who were manufacturing pads locally. And often the way we look at this is to say, let's find the companies in this mix and see if we can scale the business. Can we find some menstrual health producers? And if we gave them capital, could they grow their business, and then their business would thrive and they'd be able to supply pads to a broader set of communities? Well, here was the challenge in the Pacific. Like many parts of the world, it was a very isolated region. And so scaling from one island to another was not necessarily easy. It wasn't a simple process of moving out and being able to export. So that was the first point of looking at the context and really carefully seeing what's possible. So an impact investor or a gender lens investor looking at finding women-led businesses that can grow would look at the menstrual health in the Pacific and say, not investable. Okay, well, that might be okay. It might be okay to say, this is not investable. Investment dollars can't help. I will just take a small footnote here, is that when we decide that something is not investable, it's a pretty big decision. It often has ramifications. It has implications for how that sector, how that area of activity is valued. So one of the things that gender lens investing is always trying to do is shift the bias in what is seen as valuable. So both Regina and Luis talked about women-led businesses as not being seen as valuable as businesses led by men. That also extends, and this is where it's particularly relevant to the wash sector, that extends to products for women and girls that particularly serve women and girls, like menstrual pads, that are not thought of as a viable market, right? They're not thought of as real business. They're sort of a social good or something. And it's really important to remember, since women are, in general, in every economy, the prominent purchasers, particularly of things like healthcare, women's health can't be seen as a niche market, right? So there's a dismissive nature that happens when we decide that things that are gendered female, things that are tied to women's lives, are seen as niche, even if they are the largest part of the market. This is how bias operates, right? There's a way in which I always wonder, why do we need gender lens investing? Like, why bother, right? Why aren't all these finance people just paying attention to women and girls' lives, to their needs, to their aspirations? But they're not, right? So things like women's health, while they dominate the healthcare market, are defined as niche and get statistically less investment than other areas. So here we are back in our menstrual health example. The point I was trying to make was making sure that we didn't dismiss, that dismissing menstrual health in the Pacific in this particular case as uninvestable was a way of limiting its influence, of saying it's not as important. So, but we looked at these businesses and said, here are these 20 amazing people who were doing remarkable work in their communities, manufacturing pads, sewing them, employing a few others to sew pads. It was a very simple idea, but they didn't have any aspirations to grow their businesses. They didn't want to have bigger businesses. And so we didn't want to put them in debt so they could grow a business that they didn't want to grow. I mean, this is some of the challenges we've had in microfinance, right? Where the solution was more debt, but if the people didn't want it, then we were sort of like, well, don't you want to grow? Well, maybe not. And so in this case, the problem that these businesses faced was that 70% of the costs of their businesses were going towards the supply of materials, because it was hard to get access to materials. There's a particular fabric called pool, P-U-L, and pool is very important for making sanitary pads actually water absorbent. And so they couldn't get access to this material, and it was at a very, very high cost. So what we actually orchestrated, and it has just launched a couple years later, was a way to finance the movement of materials in the market. And so we fixed the market by decreasing the cost of materials. We created something called trade finance, which finances how trade happens, that enabled women to have, who were making these menstrual pads, to save 50% on their cost of materials and be able to purchase upfront without actually personally going into debt. Because in addition, these women were running informal businesses. Many of them were not formally registered. They were small enterprises that were not big enough to be sort of formal registered businesses. And so they were in that way left out of the system. So we created a way that informal producers in rural regions who didn't have a desire to grow could take on financing that would reduce their cost of doing business. We fixed the market. And so I think as we keep looking at gender lens investing, both looking inside of the business and saying, as many of the examples, the leadership of the business, the employees of the business, the products of the business, but also looking more broadly at the market. What's not working and who is it not working for? And can finance then, this is the question that we ask, rather than starting with how do we move capital, we start with what is the problem? And can finance be useful in solving that problem? And that's how you get to a gender lens in investing.
Wow. Thank you, Joy. This was so strong. Thank you so much. Very, very convincing. Thank you for elaborating with your examples from the Pacific Islands, the role of finance, or that finance can play when it comes to fixing the market and problems. Yeah, I am very astonished. You definitely don't need slides when you're a great storyteller and presenter. Thank you very much again. I will say that now, I mean, it's 4:45 almost. Again, I forgot to turn on my camera. There we go. We will all let all this information settle in, and we will take a 10-minute break, in which, again, we will kindly ask you to think about everything that the presenters have just said and fill out a survey, just 3 questions. And then we will be back for an exciting panel discussion. I will also play some music in the 10 minutes break to celebrate International Women's Day. So I hope we are all set for the break. We will be back at, what do we say? Yeah, 10 minutes. 5 minutes to 5, which is 5 minutes to 10 a.m. in Costa Rica, in case anybody is there. So 10 minutes from now, see you. Thank you.
esos ríos, es el final del sauce, es el final del sauce, es el final del sauce, es el final del sauce.
Okay, and we are back. Party is over. So I hope everyone is back as well. The most important people are, it's you, the speakers. And now, the almost last bit of our great webinar today is the panel discussion. And I will kindly ask on stage Genevieve Edens from Water Equity, Regina Rossman, Luis Marquez, and Joy Anderson. You may turn on your cameras now. Thank you. I will turn off mine. And now everyone will have the chance to engage with the experts. However, I want to ask my own question first that I have prepared. So this question goes to Genevieve. So Genevieve, welcome again. The narrative that we often see in the development cooperation is that women are generally seen as beneficiaries and users and less as driving forces and decision makers. To what extent can finance accelerate gender transformative approaches beyond simply seeing women as users and beneficiaries?
Thank you, Alicia, for that question. So maybe just to give a little bit of context, Water Equity is an asset manager. We invest in water and sanitation, and we're an impact investor. So part of what we look for in all of our investments is a positive impact on people's access to water and sanitation, whether that's access to piped water, access to safely managed sanitation, fecal sludge management, that kind of thing. And we have a big emphasis on gender across all of our investments. And we also see women as beneficiaries of water and sanitation. We think that part of our main focus of our gender lens is on the benefits that they'll experience through improvements in their access to water or sanitation. But when we're making investments, we look much more broadly than that. We're looking at how the company itself is managed, because some of the points that Luis raised about, the performance of companies that have stronger gender equity is actually better. So for us, we look at ESG as sort of a risk factor, and we look at women's participation across the company, whether that's in leadership at the board, in management, at the employee level, and then as including also in the value chain and as customers, we try to understand how does gender equity play a role across all those aspects of the company. And where we see a red flag, we may not invest. But we're investing in a sector that is really male dominated. A lot of our investments are in financial institutions, or they're in EPC companies, in engineering, procurement, and construction companies, and also technology. And all those sectors are pretty male dominated. So we're not going to often see female CEOs and equal gender participation at the board level. So what we do is we try to have a conversation with all of our borrowers that we're working with to try to see if we can encourage them to think a little bit more deeply about their policies throughout the company, about how they treat their female staff, for example, how they can encourage participation from women, from like entry-level employees all the way up to board members. And I think in terms of finance as a whole, there's really a drive towards responsible investing. I think it's really where the market is going. So on one hand, you could improve regulations to increase gender equity, but I think that where investors, and that's retail investors like you and me, but also high net worth individuals and institutional investors, are really taking a much deeper look at what good their capital is creating in the world. Are their investments not only generating a return, but are they actually not doing any harm and hopefully actually creating good? And so it's really, I think, where the industry is going. So the more that we're looking for projects that have that embedded within every aspect of it, or companies that are really thinking critically about how they're affecting all of their stakeholders, that's where we want to be putting our money. Does that answer your question?
Very much so. Thank you very, very much, Genevieve. Does anybody want to react to that or add anything? The panelists, the audience? Let the information sink. Okay, thank you. Moving on. Now a question that I would want to ask Louis. And this might not be a coincidence. Gender is not just talking about and with women. We have to have these conversations with men. What would be the role of men in gender lens investing or gender smart finance?
Well, as you've seen, men are basically, the great majority of the decision makers in the finance field and infrastructure also. So as we were saying, so they have to be part of the equation, right? I feel like I used to work at the Inter-American Development Bank, and we worked, our hardest and toughest moments and meetings working on gender was with the infrastructure team, which was all men as well, and things have changed, obviously. And I was thinking that, well, there's the hearts and minds argument, right? So I feel like Joy did a very good mix of both the hearts and minds in her story, and I was trying to get it as well. You try and go in with the data and but with the hearts as well. And I think highlighting the men that are doing, that are promoting gender is important, right? So not only convincing them, but once they're convinced, even if they're just starting out, putting them out there. One thing we did at the IDB a lot was giving them roles as speakers. Sometimes we were worried because we didn't know what they were going to say, or if they were really had fully internalized everything, but putting them there was important. Always being careful not to pink wash, right? To put them there, if they're not really committed, etc. But I don't want to say putting them on a pedestal, but then definitely shining a spotlight on the ones that are doing well is good. And then carrot and stick, which should work for women and men, but since we have mainly men in this, making decisions here, is important. And I was trying to get that in the presentation because the carrot is obviously, well, here are all these business opportunities. Here are all these different investors, financiers that are looking to invest with a gender lens that can, there's all this money moving in this direction. You can do well by doing good. And so convincing them on that. And the stick is for organizations like GIZ, et cetera, is to put in requirements and always being careful not to just be seen as gender police, right? And having both that carrot and a stick, but having some clear incentives, some clear, minimum standards that you can put into your your agreements. And so I think that's important. And I think, again, good for women and men, but I think that most of the men are decision makers. And then there is a bit of sensitizing, and I think that we try to work with myths. So for example, talk to men about this not just being about women, being and then this meritocracy argument, but it is hard, right? So I think it's good. It's a good place to start is to start with those that are already convinced or that are getting convinced, and then leave the harder ones for later.
Okay, thank you. Then just a brief follow-up question, because and I saw here in the chat that also Lesha commented, Lesha Whitmer, she commented, I think when you were talking about investors, why they are afraid of the word gender, would you say that this is also because mostly investors, the investors you talked about in the region are male? Would that be different if they were more women?
We talked to some women that were also, I mean, we can get into that, and I'm sure Joy has opinions on that too. But no, I think the word, sometimes they didn't want to be branded as a gender lens investor, and we've seen this across emerging markets. And I think that has to do with them being afraid that if they say suddenly we care about this issue, it means that we don't care about men, or somehow we care about gender but not about the finance. And so I think they're they're very worried to be seen as doing something on this issue at the cost of something else. So I think that's what it is, right? And then also this issue where there's still this perception that working on gender, working to support women is somehow less meritocratic, or it's a quota or something like that. So I think that's the issue that they're afraid of.
All right, thank you. And you said that Joy might want to react to this. Do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. One of the things that is one of the reasons we pushed very hard in the early years to have the field be defined as about gender versus as about women, partly because gender is about all genders, not just women, right? Because this isn't actually just about women. It's about the power dynamics between genders. And it's interesting that we're in a position where because of where the world is, we have to rationalize and make a case for investing in a woman-led business and having more than one woman on a board, or having one woman on a board. It's just worth noting, we've got challenged recently to do a study on a case for an all-male board. What actually is the case for that? Because we assume that that's what normal is, and then we rationalize an alternative. But we should be writing reports on what is the case for an all-male board, and is there a reason to think that it's better? Because many people seem to think that it is, and so how do we raise that question? So one is to make sure that we're thinking about power, right? Because gender, using the term gender instead of women, makes it about a power relationship that can be analyzed versus finding a woman, right? So we often joke that gender lens investors, many of them, that what they're doing is they're trying to spot women. Well, that's not analysis. And so I think the other piece that's worth reinforcing is, I don't think there's anything innately better. That's why I love Luis and others, people like Lauren Rodwin at the Development Finance Corporation, DFC, or Bob Webster at CEIF, right? I can think of many men who are really great gender lens investors. And so you don't have to be a woman to do gender analysis. There actually isn't any relationship between being a woman and your ability to analyze patterns in a market that allow you to see how gender influences the patterns in that market. So we push a lot on making sure that gender lens investing is seen as a form of analysis versus just seen as a prioritization of women over men. So that's my maybe somewhat longer answer than you wanted, but it's a great question.
Never too long an answer. Gender is for everyone. Yes, absolutely. Anybody would like to react to that, or shall I go on with my next question? Next question. Alrighty. Regina, in the wash sector, projects with gender indicators generally count heads and don't go any further. I can tell from my own project. What can wash professionals learn from gender lens finance with regards to going beyond quantities towards gender intentional actions?
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, that's a very good point, and one that we emphasize a lot. It's not just about counting heads. Gender disaggregated data is the first step, but it isn't by all means the answer. And it's not enough. You can't lean back when you're like, of which 40% are women? That's not all that you can do. And so one thing that at Convergence we often argue, and actually we argue together with Criterion Institute on that, is that it is much cheaper and more beneficial to integrate gender at the outset of a program or an infrastructure project or whatever you are doing than to integrate it retrospectively. And so to give you an example, if you are about to design toilets or even latrines for a school or a hospital or wherever, and all the engineers and all the people involved are men, then they may simply forget about things that women and girls need, such as, for example, a hook, right, to hang a purse or a bag or whatever you carry with you as a woman, or a waste bin to dispose of products that are used in menstrual hygiene management, for example. And so it will be much more expensive to then add these things afterwards than to just make sure you checked with a woman at the beginning and asked whether anything is missing in that facility, right? And so that's just one example. So in the design process of whatever you're doing, make sure you have checked with the intended beneficiary group, which almost always includes women, and make sure you have actually catered your products and services to women. And then one other thing that at Convergence we often see is that if you are able to talk about how you have integrated gender, this can actually be an advantage for raising capital as well, because there is a lot of investors out there, not just the ones we mentioned, also a lot of development agencies who have mainstreamed gender equality in their operations. And so for you, it will be the basic entrance requirement to even be eligible for funding or investment from that organization. And so it also can simply be a case in itself, right? Like if you have that from the start, it will be easier for you down the road raising capital. And so there's many good reasons why you should do it, and there's many ways how. And gender disaggregated data is a great first step, but it should not end there. You should always try to go further, because if in the end, if you collect gender disaggregated data, you have analysis a little bit, but it doesn't necessarily mean you translate that into action yet, right? So the action is really what you should try to get at, and that can involve all kinds of measures.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you for your input. I can see people are nodding. Good. Anybody wants to react to this? No, Luis, you posted a report in the chat box. Thank you very much. I think I have a next question.
I was actually, Regina, I was looking for the paper that we wrote together. If you could, if you have that, I must have it someplace. But that sort of, how do we retrofitting gender, putting gender in at the end and then fixing for gender is in general more expensive than putting it up front, and especially in infrastructure projects where the costs up front drive so much of what happens later. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Joy, actually, for the buzzword infrastructure projects. Then I will come up with a question to you and have the question to Genevieve afterwards, because it fits so well. And if you have any other reports that you would want to post in the chat box for us, for our website and for the audience, please feel free to do so. Together with our partners at GIZ, we build, amongst other things, toilets, hand washing stations, wastewater treatment plants, and so forth. And we focus on the environmental risks. So environmental risk of infrastructure is what we look at. This is understandable, but why is applying gender lens, and I think you have already made the case a little bit, but please do it again. Why is applying a gender lens in the context of infrastructure projects critical to their long-term success and sustainability?
Yeah, so I think I'll take this from two angles. One is, so infrastructure has been something that's been focused on in terms of climate. And there are many people and many other reasons. And right now there is so much money moving towards infrastructure as stimulus for the recovery. And I can drop into the chat later. Criterion wrote a piece recently about, we called it 10 points of materiality in looking at the economic recovery. How do we actually analyze for gender, analyze for the sort of diverse experiences as material to the signs that we see in recovery? And I think it's really critical. Louise's points before about the I think you had put in something about sort of the lack of capital moving to women. There's a disproportionate shutdown on how much money is moving to women right now in some pretty important ways, despite the fact that women's businesses, small businesses, are often part of the recovery. So what does that have to do with infrastructure? Historically, as economies, what we do to stimulate the economy is invest in large infrastructure projects. And there was an article recently in an Australian, there was an incident in Australia recently where a minister was defending an investment in infrastructure because women drive on roads too, which isn't necessarily naming that this is particularly intentionally designed to benefit women, because the large studies show right now that the way that we need to stimulate the economy to be able to enable women to participate more fully are investments in the care economy. We should reframe and think about healthcare as infrastructure rather than only building sort of large traditional infrastructure projects. So I think there's a way in which right now in the economy, there's a need to sort of rethink what infrastructure is useful and who are we building it for, and what are our assumptions in how that infrastructure will drive growth, because we tend to have we have assumptions built into what we think drives growth. So the second piece in infrastructure is looking at, and Genevieve had said this before, how do we look at risk? So we often make a case in looking at gender that we're naming opportunities. We're making the business case for investing in women. We're saying that if you put more women on boards, they will increase their returns. Well, there's a broader argument about how do we actually understand how gender patterns in the world affect risk. So Criterion, about 3 years ago now, launched a campaign to prove that we can use finance to address gender-based violence. And thinking about ways to look at that, look at how to look at that relationship. Right now, we have a significant project that is looking at the relationship between infrastructure and gender-based violence. In particular, understanding how looking at gender-based violence in infrastructure projects can help you see potential risks down the road. So one piece of this is about, well, there's many things, and IADB is really a leader in this in a lot of ways, and looking at how the projects are structured and what safety measures are put in place. So historically, the look at gender-based violence has been in kind of do no harm and how to make sure that we're reducing potential risks of impact. Sorry, making this too complicated, but most of the work right now in the relationship between gender-based violence and infrastructure is in do no harm. How do we look at projects and ensure that how the construction happens isn't disproportionately impacting women or putting them at risk? And especially since infrastructure projects often happen in the midst of climate disasters or as recovery, you end up with a sort of gender-based violence goes up in disasters. That is, it goes up, as you've just seen with COVID, in any times there's significant stress, gender-based violence increases. And how do we address that to ensure that we are not putting women at risk in how infrastructure gets put back in place? So that's one piece. The second thing is to look at the long-term stability of the country, right? As you're putting investments in infrastructure, what people are financing is a 10 or a 20-year bond, not 2 years, not now. They're financing the future. And so one of the things that we've actually found is significant research to show that country level stability, the stability of a country, correlates with violence against women. And it is in fact a leading indicator. If violence against women is going up, that is a leading indicator that state stability is going down. And so that's an interesting data point for people in finance. So one of the things that we're doing with a set of DFIs across the country and actually across the world and across development finance institutions globally, but also with environmental, social governments, investors, is to look at that political risk, right? One of the things that investors look at constantly is what is the political risk? And how can we name countries that are addressing gender-based violence? Many countries in Latin America are doing an exceptional job of actually intentionally addressing gender-based violence. How does that then get named as something that is increasing state stability? And how do we make those kinds of ties more meaningful? Lots more I can say about that.
Thank you. Very interesting, very interesting and insightful correlation that you stated right there. And we will all be happy to read more about this, because I'm sure that for many of us in the audience, it's the first time that we hear about this linkage, that when you explain it, it makes perfectly sense, but you don't see it before because it's not like the way we were trained. It's not intuitive. So thank you very much for outlining this. I will have one last question before wrapping this up to Genevieve. Now it's your turn. Thank you. So the SDG 6 synthesis report that, of course, we have all read states lacking human resources as one of the main bottlenecks that we face in the WASH sector. Investing in career perspectives of young female professionals, placing incentives for them to remain and advance in the sector will counter the shortages in human resources that are constraining the sector at all levels. This is not written in the report. This is my conclusion. To what extent can gender lens investing or gender smart finance bring this to the forefront?
That is a great question. So I think as an investor, when we're looking at investing in infrastructure, what we see as one of the big barriers is just the performance management in general for many service providers. It's really often difficult markets to work with. Revenue collection can be difficult. Maintaining pipelines can be difficult. So it's really about the internal performance management. And that, as investors, we connect really strongly to leadership and to employee management. One of the things that we look for is employee turnover as an indicator of, how productive and strong is this company? Are they, having massive turnover? So they're constantly training and hiring and spending lots of energy, training new staff, which can really suck out productivity for a company. And when we think about sort of a talent gap, I think often you think, well, there's no women available or interested, so we have to find them somewhere. I think it's sort of a misnomer. There's not really a talent gap. It's more encouraging women to join the field, sort of like entry level issue, which starts with policy. It's about, training women, encouraging them to go into technical fields, or policy around how do you consider different fields from a gender perspective. Some are sort of for women and some are for men. How can you change that? That's getting women in. But then it's internal company management in terms of how they're promoting women. So another thing that we look at is, what percentage of men are promoted compared to women? So do we see that women are kind of stuck in roles? They're not able to advance internally, or they need to switch companies to keep moving forward. So those are all things that service providers can think about internally as they're looking at that pipeline. So I think it can't just be finance coming in and sort of dictating. I think it's a combination of public and private, and it's a combination of this is actually good business. Making sure that you're recruiting a diverse workforce, because with diversity comes better ideas in many cases. And that you have strong management in place all the way from HR through your technical management. So I think as investors, that's something that we're looking for as part of our risk mitigation. We actually include that as part of our credit score analysis, not just our ESG score, because the two are so linked quite closely. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a follow-up question. US Director at Water Equity, how are you handling the talent gap in the sector?
Well, so at Water Equity, part of what we're doing is trying to look at our own internal gender equity, thinking about diversity internally, because I think for everyone, it really needs to start looking inward. So that's part of what we're doing. We're thinking about who are we hiring and what skills do they have. When we're looking at potential borrowers or investees, we do definitely not seek out only women. So we're not looking for the female CEO to invest in, and instead it's a much broader analysis. Our partner organization, so we actually work with water.org, which is a nonprofit, and they provide technical assistance. And they're really focused on community-based infrastructure, sort of as a pilot project, and thinking about, since women typically are the main beneficiaries or users of a lot of these products, they're the ones who are fetching water from a water point. How can they involve women from the community into management of the project in a deeper way? So we rely on the technical assistance providers who can actually do that on the ground work and partnerships with them. And then we can come in and provide the capital once the enterprise is ready for investment. So I think, as Joy said, money is not always the answer. In some cases, a company does not need debt. And in fact, it will harm them. So what we try to do is really understand, when is it appropriate for us to come in, both from a risk perspective for us and for what the company needs.
Perfect. That makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, we could continue this conversation forever, but actually we can't. We need to wrap this up. We have 4 minutes left. So I would like to give you the opportunity to say some famous last words. Whoever wants to. I know Regina wants to, so please, you can wrap this up, Regina. Thank you. And Joy, Louise, Genevieve, you can chip in.
All right, I keep this brief. I really love the fact that today we talked a lot about gender as a risk factor and not only gender as an opportunity, because if there's one takeaway I'd like you to take home, it's not just about increasing social impact and the positive, hearty, bloomy word out there. It's also that if you are not going on this topic seriously, and if you're not paying attention to gender factors, it will become a risk. Whether you are a company or an institution, it will have reputational risks, it will have material risks in infrastructure, for example. And so it's about time that people start paying attention. And so I think that topic, the risk element, still doesn't get enough attention, because it's easier to talk about the positive effects and increasing the economic pie and blah, blah, blah. But I think if you talk to financial investors, they listen to risk more than to opportunity, because everybody talks about opportunity to them all day long, right? Everybody has a great opportunity. But so if you get them by the risk part, it will be a much more straightforward way to get their ear, because they do risk assessments all day long. So if that's one takeaway, then I'd leave it there. And thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'll build on Regina's point also to broaden it out of, and I 25 years ago, that seems like a long time ago, but in my 20s, I was a high school teacher. And so part of my journey working in finance has been about continuing to expand who sees themselves as able to engage with finance, who can say, Regina can say, because she's extraordinarily experienced in this area, well, this is how investors look at things. And so for anybody who's on this call for whom finance is new, and you might have felt alienated by the language, my advice to you is to sort of keep leaning in, because being able to, finance is one of the most powerful systems on the earth. It holds a significant amount of power to define what is seen as valuable, both in the world broadly, but also inside of governments. And so thinking about how to question what people in finance are saying as absolutely true, right? I was once in a government as an investor walked in and said, well, investors don't care about gender. Like, how do you get to say that? Like, that's not necessarily, there's a lot of investors who care about gender. You don't get to just name that. And so thinking about how to challenge assumptions, and as we move increasingly towards the SDGs being tied to private finance, I think there's more and more that we need to be able to do to be able to see the logic in finance and challenge it, but also then beyond the people who are working inside of government being able to do that, also equipping civil society to be able to do that as well. Because if civil society in their communities can't see what's happening when the impact investors come to town and they look like they want to help, but they might not be helping all the time. Just saying, sometimes impact investors don't help. And so how do you actually equip civil society to be able to be engaged in that conversation? Sorry, that's my final point.
Thank you so much. Genevieve, Louis, you want to add on that?
I can add just
I'll
briefly.
just say that. Go ahead, Genevieve.
Louise.
Sorry.
I would just say really quickly that I think that's right, that finance is part of, so water and sanitation as a human right is not just about the private sector, and it's not just about the public sector. It's really about the cooperation between the two. Even when it's a public owned utility, there is private sector involvement in the value chain. So investors and finance are playing a role. And I think the more that there's alignment on what we're looking for, the better functioning this will be for all of the beneficiaries and all of society. Luis, back to you.
I was going to say that I know that some of the projects I talked about Latin America, but a lot of you are working on the English-speaking Caribbean side of things. And to say that one of the biggest challenges left there is that people think that gender is solved in the English-speaking Caribbean versus Latin America, where people might tell you they don't want to do it for another reason. So just to say that I shared a report on that, but just generally speaking, there's still a lot of work to do, and particularly in the communities that are more the gender gaps are bigger in the Caribbean for the women that are in the rural areas or in the areas that are more marginalized. So it's definitely not done, and but it's something that comes up a lot, and because there is a lot of these women in management in the Caribbean. Anyway, just to say that, and that we're happy to talk to anybody, here to help.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This has been really, really great. Wonderful panel. Wonderful experts. Thank you all for joining. This has been a Crew Plus Academy webinar. You can find more information about the Crew Plus Academy on our website. And we will upload the recording of this great webinar also on YouTube, as I mentioned in the beginning, and upload the slides on the website. Stay tuned for more, and thanks again to our presenters. Have a good day, good evening. Bye-bye.